Okay, I mean, so I will talk about the kind of current pressing issues, and I think one is about the quandary that I suppose cross-strait relations will now be in because of what we've learned in the last month of what Russia's done with Ukraine. The second is a sort of about the options that the last month now leaves for all other issues, including, of course, this. Um, and then, just finally some observations about what's not the same. I mean, because, this is not really a parallel. I think sometimes it can be very unhelpful. Um, I mean, the kind of way in which this issue has arisen, as I understand it, between Russia and Ukraine is in some ways not a surprise, in some ways a big surprise. I mean, the discontent about NATO, Russian nationalism, the increasing autocratic sort of slide of Putin's leadership mean that we've ended up in a place where I think we kind of should have had an idea we would end up, but it's awful that we've ended up here. This is, for Europeans, a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy because we now see Europeans basically butchering each other in a territory very, very close to the heart of Europe, and with the awful possibility that this will be extended and that we're dealing with a situation that is awfully likely to get out of control and in some ways already has. This is not to undermine the incredible heroism of Ukrainian people and their leaders who have been quite extraordinary in their resilience. But this shows you that we have been tremendously complacent. So I suppose lesson number one is we should never stop thinking about the worst case scenarios because they can really happen. On the kind of Taiwan-China parallels, I think we have to be very, very cautious. It seems to me, despite all of the chatter, that China would be crazy to move from its position of inactive neutrality. And those who saw the Chinese ambassador to America, Qin Gang, talk over the weekend, I mean, I think that seems the kind of position that makes sense to me. Yep, China has got an important relationship with Russia. It doesn't like America. It doesn't like Europe. It's tired of that old world structure. But it's also pragmatic and it doesn't want to blow everything in a reckless way. And I think that if there's one positive that might come out of this horrendous situation, it might be that there is a kind of lot of thinking in Beijing about the terrible, terrible reputational and other costs and moral costs of doing what Putin has done. Beijing has much more to lose if it were to act recklessly, which hopefully it won't. Its economy is 6 times the size of Russia's. It's a global power, and I don't think it considers Russia as a global power. It thinks of Russia as a regional power. It also must look at the practicalities of what Russia has been doing with this land war, and I stress it is a land war. An amphibious landing, I can't imagine, would be remotely easy. I mean, the last one in Europe was in the Second World War in very specific circumstances. And therefore, it must look at, I think, 2 aspects of what's happening, and, well, 3 aspects. And maybe that's going to totally reshape its thinking about what to do over this issue. The first is that it's going to learn, as a power that has not had military combat experience since 1979, that military activity is really high risk and tough. For a high risk averse leadership, I think that at least gives us some solace. The second is that when you're dealing with a highly mobilized, highly motivated population, you have a problem because you're dealing with a war that in many ways could never be won. For me, I cannot see with Putin and Ukraine what you do with 44 million people, though I know that 10 million may awfully be displaced at the moment, when they don't accept your rule. It's clear, it seems to me clear, that whatever intelligence the Russians had about sentiment in Ukraine, it was really, really kind of poor, because it just did not see the power of how people in democracies with a strong sense of their identity don't want to give that up. And I think this is really, really, of course, relevant to the Taiwan issue. Identity issue is not something that can be negotiated. You will never win this conflict unless you find some political arrangement. And I suppose finally, it is the issue of the West's unity. And I say, as a European, having been very pessimistic about how we ever live up to our values, that for once it seems, at the moment at least, that Europeans, Americans in NATO are actually doing what they say they believe in. I think the greatest strategic mistake has been made, probably by Russia and China and Europe and America, is the assumption that the other side doesn't believe anything and it just does what it thinks is in its interests. For instance, as Europeans, we never really listen much to China when it talks about socialism with Chinese characteristics and think it's a fairy tale story. But I think on some level, Chinese leaders do believe in what they say. And it's good to see European leaders now, in the sanctions and other measures they've taken, actually doing what they say that they believe in. And I think for China to look at this, it will have to really factor in that it is not going to, on this issue, be dealing with a West which is fragmented, battling with each other. It is going to unite them if it does anything intemperate. But I don't think that these are, these are probably more reasons to say that Russia-Ukraine is not a good parallel for the Taiwan issue, and that Taiwan has specificity, which I think it will be good to hear other people's perspective on. For me, I think the concluding thing that I would like to raise is it seems that we should never underestimate, for even very rational leaders, and I think that leaders in Taipei and in Beijing are rational, this issue of honor, of autonomy, of respect, of basically feeling like they need to do things, the emotions of politics rather than simply the rational side. And I know that rations and emotions are very tightly linked, but people can do very, very strange things when they're driven by an evaluation which is more emotional maybe than it is about pure calculation of outcomes. If you were to put on paper what Putin has lost in the last month or so, it would probably be pretty sobering. The Russian economy is obviously in a terrible position. It's the sentiment of people is hard to see, but there's obviously divisions. There are huge risks. This would be nothing compared, of course, to what might happen in Beijing if we were to end up with a leader who, after many years in power, like Xi Jinping, were to feel that they actually could do something that would be crazy. This is kind of scary. I mean, it's perfectly possible that the same situation exists in the halls of power in Beijing as it does in Moscow, where you have a leader that no one dares to say any opposition to. And if it does seem that Xi Jinping's leadership is likely in the third term later this year, is going to be driven by these great narratives of national reunification and the ambition to restore this myth of the reunified China, we have a problem. We have a big, big problem, because those can supplant all other kind of thinking. I suppose just finally, it means then that we have to kind of really take seriously a sort of much more active and unified response on what it means to say that there is an alliance with Taiwan as a democracy and that it means something. And that means, I suppose, being very much better at communicating clarity about the consequences and costs of not acting intemperately on this issue, but nor ignoring the fact that the logic of Chinese politics at the moment, and again, I don't see an easy solution to this, is to make this issue so much more important. It's really, really worrying. Unless this is just rhetoric, unless it is that the Xi leadership is just doing this for symbolic reasons, that might be possible, but it's hard to think that they would put so much effort into it. I don't see an easy way of just wishing this away. If there is a timetable in Xi Jinping's head, and if there is an idea of doing something, we better work out pretty quickly what the parameters of that are and how we can work, and Taiwanese, of course, most particularly and importantly, can work within that to make sure that we don't end up with an absolutely horrendous situation, kind of unthinkable misery that we're seeing, for instance, in Ukraine at the moment with this unjust, illegal, and appalling invasion. Thank you very much.